So in this video we're going to be talking about the contribution of popular movements in mobilizing society and challenging the existing order, but primarily the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And we've talked about these groups in class and you should have done reading about them, but this is just some extra detail. So the Sons of Liberty there's sort of two schools of thought. A lot of people kind of view them as this secret revolutionary group that were running underground, and they were formed to protest the Stamp Act, and they were united in their actions. But it's actually more likely that it was just an umbrella term, so that is a term that was used to describe anyone who was opposing British policy, whether or not they were officially affiliated with the actual Sons of Liberty group themselves. So sometimes it would just be if someone spoke out against British policy, they would be called a Son of Liberty, even if they weren't with the group, even if they didn't necessarily agree with the group in its entirety. This is what their flag looked like, so if you ever see an image like this, you'll know that it refers to the Sons of Liberty. Sometimes it also has the "Don't Tread on Me" snake on it. This one. This image is actually there was a 2013 or 2015 mini-series called The Sons of Liberty. It's only 3 episodes. I'm going to see if I can track it down, but you might want to look for it as well. So, the Sons of Liberty, some of them were in a secret revolutionary group who had a shared goal and meetings. Others were just anyone who disagreed with the British. Regardless of what type of Son of Liberty you were, it is what we call a grassroots group, which means its roots come from the ground, which means it's something very locally based, it's something for everyone to participate in, and it starts from the ground and works its way up to fighting the king. So it's not something that is ordered by Parliament or a colonial assembly, it's something that starts from like the community level. And they're famed for using extreme forms of civil disobedience. So civil disobedience is when you don't necessarily break the law, but your actions would not be looked upon positively by your rulers. So examples of this include threats and violence, which was used to intimidate both loyalists and British officials. So loyalists are people who support the British Parliament and the King. And their goal was basically they were terrorists who were using these actions to upset the Parliament, to terrify people who supported them into changing their policies, their actions, and how they treated the colonies. Now, the Sons of Liberty actually grew out of this smaller group called the Loyal Nine, and they were a core group who established the Liberty Tree as a meeting place. So they were the first ones to really sort of go wild. And these Loyal Nine, none of them were actually founding fathers, or at least not founding fathers that are commonly heard of. So here we can see we have a distiller, so someone who makes alcohol, another distiller who was someone who was a cousin of Sam Adams, another distiller, a brazier. I'm not sure what that is, I'll quickly. I think a brazier is someone who works with brass and like metal and maybe just makes these fire pit things. We also have painters, a newspaper printer, a ship captain, a jeweler. So none of these people are lawyers or journalists or orators. They're all tradesmen. But they were really important because they were the predecessors of the Sons of Liberty. They were the first sort of group that really emerged, and so they were very influential. But they were completely secret, so not a lot of known about them today. The Loyal Nine were most famous for let me just go forward in the slides a little bit to see if I can find it, but for the attack here, we can see in this image, the first real violence was hanging the effigy or the representation of stamp collector Andrew Oliver, hanging him in a tree, and that was really their doing. And what the Loyal Nine would do was sort of identify who the targets of mob violence would be, and then they'd spread it throughout the larger Sons of Liberty group. So some famous people who we do know about who were connected to the Loyal Nine but were not in the Loyal Nine included Sam Adams, whose cousin was a Loyal Nine member, John Adams, another cousin, James Otis, who said no taxation without representation, John Hancock, who we're going to talk a little bit about in this video, and Paul Revere, who we will talk about when we discuss the Boston Massacre. He's really famous for really creating propaganda about the Boston Massacre and showing the atrocities, quote unquote, that Britain were committing against the colonies. So in the more general Sons of Liberty, we had lots of different types of members. So we had lots of lawyers and orators, and they're the ones that we hear about now because they were the ones doing the writing and the speaking about how the British Parliament needs to treat the government, the colonies, sorry. And so we also have merchants, and now this is a key group in the Sons of Liberty because these are the ones who are most commonly affected by these acts, particularly the Sugar Act and the Incoming Tea Act, because they're the ones who have to bear the brunt of the price hike, and these are the ones who are most likely previously involved in smuggling, and so those smuggling things have been cut off. We also have artisans and engravers, people who are making things, and these engravers like Paul Revere are especially important because, like I said, they are able to use their art as propaganda for the Sons of Liberty cause. Now, the historian Countryman has this really interesting quote that I think is one we should definitely know, which, when he describes the Sons of Liberty, he describes them as occupying a place between the elite and genuine plebeians. Maybe you've heard people be called a pleb before, but a plebeian is a commoner. So the Sons of Liberty are important because it was a way to connect the richest of the rich. John Hancock, one of the Sons of Liberty members, was the richest man in Boston, but he was working with everyday commoners. And so the Sons of Liberty is important because it had mass appeal and mass membership. Much like the Stamp Act affected everyone, the Sons of Liberty represented everyone, and that's a really important fact to remember. The Stamp Act affected everyone, the Sons of Liberty represented everyone, and they occupied a place between the elite, the highest of the high, and genuine commoners. I want to talk about two different Sons of Liberty now. The first one that I'll talk about is Sam Adams, and he's often regarded as the founder of the Sons of Liberty, even though he wasn't in the original Loyal Nine. And Sam Adams was described by a British governor as being the most dangerous man in Massachusetts, and that was because he was a really prominent agitator. An agitator is someone who really gets in under Britain's skin and really gets people hyped up, gets people angry, and gets people, especially, openly attacking the British government. Following the Townshend duties, Sam Adams famously wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter. And a circular letter gets its name not because it's written on a frisbee or a pancake, but because it circulates throughout the colonies. It's something that's shared between colonial assemblies, between different colonies, and between colonists living in the same colony. And in the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which he wrote with James Otis, he argued that the Townshend Acts were unconstitutional, and we will be looking at that in class. The next Son of Liberty that I would like to talk about is this guy John Hancock, and he's actually really famous not for being a Son of Liberty, but for having a super fancy signature that's on the Declaration of Independence when America actually formally split with Britain. If you have a look, this is the declaration where they all said, you know, we're no longer happy with Britain, we will become our own states of America, our own country. And like, take a look at John Hancock being the first person to sign and saying, I'm just going to take up this whole thing, even though like he didn't even write it, he wasn't that important. And we have all of these other people who are quite famous with their much smaller signatures. So John Hancock, like, it's a bit of a move. The Declaration was written by these guys, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and can you imagine being them and then having, like, John Hancock's massive signature on your work? Crazy. But part of the reason that maybe John Hancock felt entitled to have his signature so large on this document was that he was one of the richest men in America. He didn't earn he earned his money, but he wasn't a self-made man. His family was quite wealthy, and he built upon that wealth. So he was a merchant who was a known smuggler, and that's part of how he got to be so wealthy, was that he was cheaply importing smuggled goods from France. So when the Sugar Act and other such acts prevented his smuggling, he became really disgruntled and frustrated. He, in fact, was arrested after a writs of assistance found evidence of smuggling in his home, and John Adams had to act as his lawyer in trial. So John Hancock represents members of the Sons of Liberty who were doing it really for economic means. And these two men, John Hancock and Samuel Adams, were actually singled out. Later we're going to look at a battle between the British and the American, and after that battle, the British governor, he issued a pardon for all of the Americans who fought against him. And he said that everyone should not be punished except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who he said they should absolutely be punished. And this kind of actually backfired because it just made them more popular amongst the Sons of Liberty and added to how well they were known and how much they were respected for their actions. So what were the actions of the Sons of Liberty? They're kind of in twofold. We've talked a bit in class about the acts of violence, tarring and feathering that they were committing. So definitely part of their main actions was intimidation and acts of violence. They intimidated Andrew Oliver, who actually, this is quite sad, but he didn't support the Stamp Act. It was just his job to give the stamps in collection of the money. He privately did not believe in it, but I guess he probably could have quit earlier then. So he was thoroughly intimidated. They would, as we said, hang up his little effigy or representation of him. They also ransacked British Governor Hutchinson's house, causing £250,000 worth of damage. So there was violence, but then again there was also still more restrained modes of protest, such as writing pamphlets like the Massachusetts Circular Letter and delivering speeches. Finally, and this is probably actually one of their most influential acts, was the organisation of boycotts. And in particular, this is one that really helped to end the Stamp Act, where English businessmen were losing so much money because of the boycotts done by the Sons of Liberty that they too advocated to British Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act, to cancel it. And that leads me to talk about the Daughters of Liberty. And these women formed as a complement to the Sons of Liberty, and they harnessed the important role of women in colonial America. So women actually ran the domestic sphere, or the home, and because of that, they organised and ran the domestic revolution. While the Sons of Liberty were politically protesting and socially protesting, the women were protesting from home, and it had a significant impact. And that's because they had an important role in colonial America as the main purchaser of foodstuffs for the family, which allowed them to place significant pressure upon Britain. Examples of how they contributed to the revolution and revolutionary sentiment was that they organised boycotts and alternatives to British importation. So they were our original environmental queens. An example is that they would practice mending clothes or recycling clothes instead of buying British goods, and would even blend their own tea, such as Liberty tea, which was a substitute to the British tea that was advertised at the time. For example, they would there's a famous story of in North Carolina in 1774 when 50 women gathered to drink wild raspberry tea and signed these non-importation agreements, so agreements to boycott. However, they weren't really respected, especially by the Englishmen. So one Englishman who heard about this particular gathering called it a marvellous joke and wrote quite a sarcastic comment about it, in which he says, "I say, should they attack us, the most fatal consequences to be dreaded." So they weren't very taken seriously. And they were more passive in their resistance. But their boycotts were successful, and their influence was felt across the Atlantic Ocean. So their influence was felt in England. Another tactic that they organised was encouraging merchants not to trade with British ships. And this was to kind of crush British trade and force them to repeal the Townshend Acts and its associated taxes. So this encouragement did have an effect where the downturn in trade hurt British merchants and manufacturers, who then would pressure their members in Parliament to repeal laws. So the Daughters of Liberty and the Sons of Liberty both did have a direct impact upon British merchants and manufacturers that then pressured Parliament into getting rid of some of these laws. However, the Sons of Liberty were also sometimes punished for their actions, and they were punished in a way that not only were they themselves targeted, but the 13 colonies themselves were targeted for the actions of the Sons of Liberty. When we watch our video about the Boston Tea Party, we're going to see that the response to that was something called the Coercive Acts, and these were designed as punishment for the Boston Tea Party, which was a really violent and expensive act of protest against the British. I'm just going to talk quickly about some of the symbolism of the Sons of Liberty. Here we have a Liberty pole, and we can see on top is something called the Liberty Cap. It's also called like a Phrygian cap. And this is something that had been used throughout history. I think it originated in the Netherlands, actually. But it was something that many Sons of Liberty would wear, or they would depict in their cartoons. Lady Liberty would be wearing a hat that looked like this. So like I said, it's come from like ancient mythology, but we can see we have Lady Liberty here holding the American flag and wearing the hat. And here as well, here we have some revolutionary soldiers wearing the hats, and that is Papa Smurf. So they would sometimes plant these large poles with the hats on top. This would just let people know that there were Sons of Liberty nearby. They would also go through town singing songs. I'm going to play a song now. It actually was written in 1957, but it uses some Sons of Liberty songs that we still have today, and you kind of get the feel for how they were protesting. This lasts for about 2.5 minutes, so you could probably skip to 18 minutes forward in the video. You might have noticed some of them have feathers and face paint on. They're actually depicting themselves as Native Americans. And this was a costume that they wore when they went on the Boston Tea Party, and it had two purposes. One was obvious. It was to disguise who they were so they could not get in trouble for that act of violence and basically theft. But it also was sort of like a mascot for them. They were saying, you know, we are Americans, we're like the Native Americans. Now it would be cultural appropriation, but back then it was a way of them distinguishing themselves from the British.
Seed in our homeland, boys, let it grow where all can see. Feed it with our devotion, boys, call it the Liberty Tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons, yes, we are the sons of liberty. Save it from the storm, boys, water down its roots with tea. And the sun will always shine on the old Liberty Tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons, yes, we are the sons of liberty. March along with the piper, boys, we were born forever free. Let's go pay the piper, boys, beneath the Liberty Tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons, yes, we are the sons of liberty. Pay the price they're asking, boys, always pay the tyrant's fee. Never give up the struggle, boys, fight for the Liberty Tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons, yes, we are the sons of liberty. Stand for the rights of man, boys, stand against all tyranny. Hang the lance of freedom, boys, high on the Liberty Tree. It's a tall old tree and a strong old tree. And we are the sons, yes, we are the sons of liberty. It will grow as we grow, boys.
was the decoration of a Liberty Tree, and this is probably the most important symbol to the Sons of Liberty and to the American Revolution. And this was a famous elm tree, and it was one specific tree. And it was where the first act of defiance against the British occurred from the Loyal Nine, which was the hanging of Andrew Oliver's effigy. And following that, it became a meeting place for the protesters, and the trees were, as we saw in that video, decorated and really revered, which is it's a word that kind of means worshipped. Other colonies would then follow suit and select their own Liberty trees. So this tree was really a metaphor of like the growth of American independence and liberty. Some of the sources that we've looked at in the past week, we've seen dead trees. And so if you see a dead tree in an American revolutionary source, it's most likely suggesting that liberty is dead. So those are the Sons of Liberty. And just to recap, we'll go through this very briefly. So they were either a secret revolutionary group or, more commonly, anyone who opposed British policy. They started from the bottom, from community level, and used extreme forms of civil disobedience or terrorism to intimidate and outrage the British Parliament in an attempt to get change. There were originally a group called the Loyal Nine, who were various tradesmen and artisans who established the first meeting place and did the sort of first actions, as well as selecting who targets would be. However, there was also a more broad Sons of Liberty group, which was in part founded by Samuel Adams, who was considered one of the most dangerous politicians of the time because he was so pro-violence and so proactive in his response to American independence. We also had John Hancock, who is a rich old man who gets really mad when he gets in trouble for smuggling, and that's really his motivation to join the Sons of Liberty and to seek economic independence. But the members, they're not just merchants, they're not just trying to increase their own wealth, they're also everyday people who've been hurt by the different acts, particularly the Stamp Act. So their actions, we have acts of violence, we have political acts such as pamphlets and speeches, and then very importantly we have boycotts and non-importation agreements, which actually hurt Britain to the point where even English people were writing petitions to the British government to have these acts repealed. The Daughters of Liberty were instrumental in these boycotts. And that is it. Have a good day.